According to the Bible, every single person on the earth was born into the middle of a war. This war is one that cannot typically be seen with the naked eye. Its existence is not broadcast on the evening news. Its reality is not even realized by the vast majority of the population. Yet this war has raged on since the very beginning. The first shot fired in this war had a devastating effect, when the serpent entered the garden and tempted the first man and woman to disobey God, falling into sin, and then death entered the world. Sometime after, as mankind began to multiply and cover the face of the earth, the first full assault on humanity was launched. In a way, you could describe it as an alien invasion. But these invaders did not come from some distant galaxy, from some far-off star system. Rather, they descended from right above, as together they conspired to abandon their assigned posts in the firmament, where the ether carried the light of their luminescence to the four corners of the earth. These watcher angels fell from their first estates that God had set for them, and they came down to terra firma, where they began a sort of colonization campaign. They sired the Nephilim, their hybrid abomination offspring, which began to ravage the land and feed upon men. They corrupted the genetics of not just humanity, but of animals and plants as well. Using the knowledge they had been given by God to perform their original tasks in the heavens, they proceeded to teach mankind all sorts of forbidden things, in order to civilize them, to equip them in the building of cities, vast kingdoms, where these fallen angelic beings could rule as gods. The knowledge bestowed by these beings was presented as being the keys to humanity's path to enlightenment, the technological know-how that would eventually allow us to take our seats alongside them as gods. But of course, this was all a lie. This forbidden knowledge brought nothing but destruction, perversion, wickedness, and death. God, the Creator, finally became so grieved by the immensity of the wickedness on the earth and the corruption of his creation that he decided to wipe it all out and begin again, sparing one single family and the animals which God brought to ride out the waters with them. When the waters receded, the world had been cleansed from the evil that had almost wiped out humanity from the face of the earth. The great empires of the Watchers had been erased, their monuments and citadels shattered by earthquakes and buried by oceans. The angels who had conspired together against God were buried deep in the bowels of the earth, held there in the deepest darkness until the time of the final judgment of all things. The bodiless spirits of the giants, the Nephilim, were cursed to roam the earth, tortured by hunger and thirst that they could never satisfy, forever longing to have bodies to inhabit once again. Satan's direct rule over the whole earth through his vassals, the fallen Watchers, was over. But no sooner than the earth began to be filled once again with trees and plants and animals, and people began to spread out and fill it once again, did the enemy of mankind begin working, seeking to rebuild what God had destroyed, his beloved Atlantean Empire, whose sole purpose was the enslavement and destruction of mankind. But it would be different this time around. No longer did the Fallen One have the ability to send his rebellious emissaries to the earth, to take wives and build cities and palaces where such self-declared deities could sit and rule directly over their subjects. No longer could they walk amongst men and be revered for their brilliance and stature. The satanic kingdoms that would be built after the flood had to be done through the worship of now invisible deities, forced to orchestrate their rule through various systems of interdimensional communication. Since God had now bound them behind a spiritual veil, once again a spectrum of forbidden knowledge was disseminated amongst these newly reborn civilizations, in order to facilitate the connection between these civilizations and their demonic benefactors. Thus, in the courts of all the human kings and leaders of these kingdoms, worked a host of occult priesthoods, sorcerers, mediums, astrologers, and practitioners of divination. The subjects of these pagan kingdoms would demonstrate their fealty to their false, fallen, invisible gods by sacrificing to idols, building them temples, having orgies and revelries and bacchanalia. The rebellion against God resumed in earnest after the flood, from the first failed attempt by Nimrod to build a tower into the heavens and storm the throne of God, through all the following kingdoms which were founded after the scattering from Babel. After God destroyed the tower at Babel and confused the languages of mankind, paganism and occultism were gradually spread and developed throughout the world yet again, until once more the true God of heaven and earth chose to intervene, this time by setting apart a nation, a people, a kingdom to bear his name to all the others. From Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob down through Moses, Aaron, and Joshua, judges like Samson and Gideon, kings like David and Solomon, prophets like Elijah, Samuel, and Daniel, on through the centuries and amidst the rise and fall of many demonic empires, the God of all creation revealed himself and began to reveal his plan to redeem humanity from their curse of sin and death and demonic oppression. Finally, from the humble town of Nazareth, a man stepped forward and revealed himself as the promised Messiah, the Son of God, the Word made flesh, and the one whose own sacrifice would once and for all destroy the curse and make it possible for men and women to be reborn through the Spirit of God, who would actually come and live within us as the new temple of God. And from that point on, the great spiritual war began to take on a rather new twist. For many centuries that followed, the truth of God began to advance upon the various territories of these demonic kingdoms, freeing people from the bondage they had been held in for generations. And for the first time since the Great Flood, large numbers of people began to truly understand who they had actually been in servitude to in these pagan kingdoms. Throughout stretches of Europe, Africa, and Asia, the truth of Jesus kept spreading, and people kept getting set free. The first tactic Satan brought against us was brute persecution. He used his puppet emperors of the Roman Empire to imprison, kill, and torture the first Christians. But somehow this only wound up revealing the power of the gospel and the hope in eternity that it truly brought, and so faith in Jesus only spread, under the stage where the once unshakable Roman Empire began to crumble under its own heathen weight. Next, Satan tried a different approach, which in many ways proved more effective than the first. Instead of trying to crush the spread of faith in Jesus with the powers of empire, he would usurp it. From the time of Constantine onward, the enemy began a blasphemous campaign of rebranding many of his old demonic kingdoms and demonic occult priesthoods as now being Christianized. This way he could seduce the Christians with wealth, power, and earthly pleasures, and corrupt the Church of Christ from within. Pagan temples were repurposed as Christian churches. Pagan rites and rituals were reinvented as Christian ceremonies. The Roman Catholic Church slowly emerged as one of the most effective weapons against the kingdom of God, while it mockingly carried out its activities in his name, a tactic which has no doubt given the devil no small measure of sacrilegious joy. Through this earthly institutional vessel, Satan was able to prevent scores of people from actually reading the scriptures for themselves, and turned them instead back to the same bondage and darkness that the demonic systems had enforced before. Only now it was being done in the name of Jesus. Still, by the sheer grace of God, the truth endured, the gospel spread, and genuine faith in the Creator and Savior of mankind continued to grow. Satan continued to work furiously to regain control of the world of men by way of Catholic imperialism and eventually European colonialism, which, because of the advent of unprecedented naval power, began to conquer more and more of the world that was accessible by ocean. At the same time, however, the spread of imperialism all too often still brought with it the truth of the gospel, which opened the hearts and minds of the people to the true nature and identities of the pagan and shamanic religions they had traditionally held. The more Satan worked to tighten his grip on the world through imperial and economic means, the more he continued to find his kingdom being forced to operate in the shadows. The occult knowledge and pagan rituals that went all the way back to Babylon had been preserved down through the centuries by various strains of secret societies, esoteric mystery schools, and underground brotherhoods, and for the most part, this is where it remained. As much as the devil had increased his control over humanity through governments, militaries, and financial means, the truth of God had increased as well, to the degree that most populations would still never openly embrace Lucifer as the one true God, even if he did control vast empires of wealth and power through his network of lesser demonic emissaries. Witchcraft and Luciferian beliefs were not yet something that humanity as a whole would accept, and this was an objective that Satan had to achieve if indeed he was to successfully restore his absolute rule over the world and declare himself to be God. In order to get the entire world back to where Satan wanted it, he had to implement another plan, another strategy so massive in scope that most people, even the majority of those who even believe he exists in the first place, have difficulty in believing that such a thing could be pulled off. In the ancient times, when God first saved humanity from utter destruction at the hands of the fallen Watchers, and then again from the tyrannies of the demonic kingdoms, people still understood the basic nature of the realm that God had created for them. The earth was filled with plants and animals, and mankind had been given dominion over it. The heavens above were filled with the luminaries, who served the creatures below by marking the days and months and years, and allowed for navigation over vast stretches of earth as well. Those pagan kingdoms that rejected God worshipped various fallen angels as their gods, but for the most part, they still understood where those, quote, gods had come from. They still knew that they had come from the stars, from the sky, from the firmament. When the truth of God had been fully revealed through the person of Jesus, the ancient cosmology had been given its full context. The distinction between the Creator and the creation was made clear, and the futility of the rebellion by those first fallen angels was made plain to see. In order for Satan to convince the world that he was the supreme being and worthy of humanity's worship, he would have to rewrite the entire script and completely repackage himself, his kingdom, and his message. Like the recycling of an old Shakespearean play into a modern Broadway musical, in order to reintroduce and rebrand the old characters, you first have to rebrand the setting and the stage itself. Satan needed a whole new backstory, a whole new angle, through which he could gradually insert himself in his rebellious agenda against God into the hearts and minds of men. Yet it was through a familiar tactic that this new angle was achieved. The old trick of bestowing upon humanity forbidden knowledge, which plays upon our pride and arrogance, was now used again in a masterful and cunningly deceitful way. This occult knowledge, or gnosis, was rebranded as science. Much of the groundwork for this rewrite had already been laid in ancient Greece, even before Jesus had been born, by way of the so-called Greek philosophers. These were in fact men who took many of the concepts and teachings that came from the occult mystery schools, from spirit mediums and pagan ritual contact with the demonic realms, and then proceeded to pontificate on them, adding their own speculations and human-centered conclusions, which effectively sanitized these concepts from their demonic origins in the eyes of many later generations, as though they were simply the profound thoughts and musings of mere men. During the Renaissance in Europe, many of these ideas began to once again take hold, as they were increasingly considered to be harmonious with the teaching of the Bible, and slowly began to exert a greater and greater influence upon theologians and scholars throughout the largely Christianized Europe, particularly after certain works ascribed to the Egyptian magus known as Hermes Trismegistus were translated into Latin and then circulated among intellectuals with a predilection for such material. The Kabbalah, too, began to receive more attention from thinkers and monks and people with the necessary literary education, and together with writings on alchemy that came from, allegedly, the Muslim mystics, these three veins of occult knowledge and teaching began to permeate. How little do most students today realize that the bulk of those individuals revered today as having been the pioneers and visionaries of materialistic science were in fact greatly influenced by concepts that were introduced by occult manuscripts and the core tenets of mysticism. Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, Robert Fludd, Nicholas Copernicus. These are names we all learn about in school, but yet we learn about them as men who simply derived their discoveries and scientific achievements by way of pure observation and logical deduction. However, a more thorough investigation into the matter at which they arrived at their various discoveries, and the various occult materials which they were all coincidentally reading, reveals that no, these discoveries were nothing more than very ancient teachings on the nature of the cosmos and nature, simply being repackaged and reintroduced with a quasi-Christian veneer. The Copernican cosmology of a vast universe, a planetary solar system, even a Big Bang to start it all off, could be found in the Kabbalistic texts long before Copernicus. The concepts of molecules and chemical reactions, even elemental transmutation by way of atomic fusion and fission, were first presented in the more imprecise occult practices of alchemy. And the idea that nature and the cosmos was governed by invisible forces and laws, which could be discovered and calculated, and then reapplied through various technological means. This is actually an underlying precept of Hermeticism. And so, with a good measure of help by the well-financed occult brotherhoods, such as the Rosicrucians and Freemasons, the Royal Society was established as the first official organization dedicated to the advancement of scientific understanding. And the rest, as they say, is history. What had begun as a half-hearted attempt to combine the knowledge gained from the divine revelation with the knowledge gained from nature was quickly transformed into an unapologetic natural philosophy. The universe suddenly got very, very big, and God became very, very removed, to the point where then the cosmos itself was easily considered capable of having formed without God's assistance whatsoever. Models of the Copernican heavens were expanded and refined. Darwin stepped in to explain how life could have emerged from the primordial ooze, long after the globe Earth had slowly formed over billions of years from the slow gathering of cosmic dust in the vacuum of space. The universities and lecture halls, largely built and maintained by these same wealthy, blue-blooded fraternities, quickly and not surprisingly became hostile territory to anyone who dared question the new burgeoning scientific consensus. The universe was now presented as a vast, evolving, almost infinite space, with our little blue planet floating somewhere in the middle. And while man might be the pinnacle of life on this planet, he might not be alone in the universe either. And so finally, the stage had been set, and the same old characters could start to re-emerge with a new set of costumes. The 20th century. So much has happened in that 100-year span compared to the centuries that went before. It is indeed daunting to even attempt to broadly summarize any of it. While the beginning of the 20th century saw a new, yet old, cosmological paradigm put in place, at least in the halls of academia, that could theoretically provide a convincing new and deceptive pretext for a new wave of rebellious watchers, or some kind of fallen entities, to come down to Earth and present themselves as aliens, we do have to stop and consider the question of the dimensional veil, the barrier that God does seem to have put in place after the invasion of the Watchers back before the flood. Could fallen angels once again reveal themselves to humanity, this time as alien saviors, and serve as governors of Satan's earthly kingdom? Perhaps. Can demonic spirits, even now, sometimes manifest themselves in the physical realm, inhabiting people, moving objects, even attacking individuals? Yes. But is it also true that this ability for the demonic realm to interface with the physical is still limited? It would seem to be the case, and the Bible does seem to confirm that this barrier will remain in place right up until shortly before Jesus returns, when it will be removed and the spirit of Antichrist will have a period of unprecedented access to the earth and to humanity one last time before he meets his own end. While I certainly do not know conceivable practical application to these, quote, spooky actions for years and years, and in fact much of it was still being contested and debated, but then almost out of nowhere, quantum computing suddenly emerges under the steam of companies such as D-Wave, who almost instantly have working relationships with CERN, NASA, Google, and so on. These infamous black cubes have been described by their own executive as an altar to an alien god, and they claim to be able to pull complex solutions right out of this quantum realm of qubits, like a fortune teller consulting her crystal ball. But perhaps that is ironically the most perfect analogy, simply because that is ultimately the same thing that's being constructed right now. The most technologically advanced and all-encompassing spirit medium device in all of history. In many ancient temples and sacred structures, it is interesting to note that oftentimes they consisted of a square or rectangular base, topped with a circular or domed roof. It is said that this was intentionally done as a reflection of their view of the cosmos, which was comprised of the earth below and the heavens above. The temple itself, then, where the square met the circle, represented the place where it was believed that heaven and earth intersected, where the mortal met with the divine, the physical encountered the spiritual, where the temporal could catch a glimpse of the eternal. When Jesus died and rose again, the only temple on earth that was commissioned by God Himself was rendered obsolete. The curtain that separated the Holy of Holies, representing where God dwelled on the earth, was miraculously torn in half. After Jesus had returned to heaven, the day of Pentecost revealed that the very Spirit of God had been given to all who believe in Jesus, to live in us, making each woman and man who believes a living temple, a temple of God, where indeed the kingdom of heaven is manifest and then represented on the earth. When we consider the fact that the enemy of humanity, that dragon, the devil, has taken everything that God has made, everything that God has done, everything that God has said, and attempted to twist it, invert it, for his own blasphemous and defiant ends, then I would suggest that it is not ultimately that shocking of an idea to consider that this reality, this God-given gift of the Holy Spirit living within His believers, would also be something that Satan would seek to counterfeit as well. As I said before, I do not claim to know how everything will unfold, but if you've been able to follow the progression of history, of science falsely so called, and the many agendas of deception by the fallen one, so far as I have attempted to present them, then my hope is that you might see how this could very well play out. When we couple all of this with the other recent development of the rollout of the new 5G wireless system, which is being fast-tracked by the corporate technocrats with frightening haste,
the United States will be the first country in the world to open up high-band spectrum for 5G networks and applications. And that's damn important.
then when all is said and done, it is hard to see what remaining elements would yet need to be in place before that moment could arise when the quote singularity would be proclaimed, and AI is said to have achieved true legitimate sentience, and the new era of transcendent transhumanity is declared to have finally arrived. This is the Luciferian dream of technological apotheosis, the dream of transcending space and time, of defeating death itself by way of our own ingenuity, our own inherent divine potential, our own pantheistic self-realization as a species. But I must contend that such a watershed moment in history would ultimately be nothing less than a horrific, satanic Pentecost, whereby everyone who opted into the promises of the supposed techno-utopia, everyone who took the mark and opened themselves, both neurologically and spiritually, to these digital superbeings, these ethereal entities, these aliens from the quantum realm, would quickly and tragically realize that they had been fooled, and allow themselves to in fact be indwelt by an intelligence that hates them with an unholy passion, to be indwelt by the very spirit of Antichrist, who is then able to broadcast himself on all frequencies to the four corners of the earth, by way of the all-encompassing technological monstrosity, Babel 2.0, that he tricked us into building for him in the first place, simply by patiently and persistently appealing to our sinfulness, our vanity, and our pride over so many centuries. according to the Bible, every single person on the earth was born into the middle of a war. This war, however, is ultimately won or lost, not on blood-soaked battlefields, or in secret underground military installations, or even in the unseen realms of the heavens above. It is won or lost in the most mysterious realm of all, the human heart. The real battle for heaven and earth is already over. The victory is already decided. Death has already been overcome. The keys to Hades are already in the hands of the one who died and rose again. The conclusion has already been prophesied. The end will come. The heavens will be shaken. And every knee will bow when the Son of Man returns to judge all things. But you and I are here, right now, today. That is what we really have. We cannot even say for sure when all these New World Order agendas will actually come to pass, even as things progress faster and with more intensity with each passing day. We have a choice, today, whom you will be a temple for. Whose kingdom will you serve? Because make no mistake, we all serve one or the other, regardless of whether we want to admit to ourselves if there is a God or there is a devil. You may insist that the Bible is just another deception designed to oppress and control people. You may want to believe that somehow it really teaches the very secret occult knowledge that I've been exposing here as the lies of Satan. My only hope and prayer at the end of the day is that your thinking might be at least stimulated in such a way as to prompt you to go and look into things much deeper for yourself. That you might take a second look into the Bible, into the gospel, into Jesus. Ultimately, this is more important than any other conceivable topic of research. Far more important than trying to comprehend how the mechanics of the heavens really work, or unlocking the secrets of vibrational energy, or trying to decode every piece of twisted propaganda and occult symbolism that is constantly fed through the mainstream media. As this cosmological awakening continues to expand and grow, we see more and more people arguing over what the real map looks like. Arguing over how the luminaries really move. Arguing over whether the Jews or the Jesuits or the Freemasons are really at the top of the Illuminati pyramid, and so on. But when all is said and done, there's really only one thing that you absolutely, unequivocally have to get right. Who do you serve?